Okay, Kaylin, I think we can start letting everyone in. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Everyone is just filing into the meeting here. We'll just take one more moment to make sure everyone can get in and then we'll start. Perfect. It looks like we're slowing down there. So we'll get started because we have an engaging discussion today. We're really happy to have you all here, and we want to make sure we have time for this discussion. So hello everyone, and welcome to the CCUS webinar series. This is the fifth and final event in the CCUS webinar series, Working in CCUS. My name is Tamara Gale, and I am the Senior Marketing and Communications Manager at Carbon Management Canada. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and pay tribute to the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7, which include the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary, where we are currently, is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6, and we are situated on land northwest of where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, a site traditionally known as Mohkinstsis to the Blackfoot, Wincheespaw to the Stoney Nakoda, and Gutitsti to the Tsuut'ina. Today on this land and in this place, we strive to learn and grow together in a good way. So thanks again for joining us. I'm really excited for today's webinar, and we'll begin with an introduction of our speaker panel, followed by our question and answer period, through which we'll have our discussion. We'll hear from each of our speakers. We also want to provide you the opportunity to ask questions, so please do use the Q&A and the chat. My colleague Kaylin will be monitoring that for us, and we'll make sure we get your questions answered if you have them. We are also recording today's webinar so that it will be available on the Alberta Carbon Hub website after our session today. Well, welcome to my speaker panel. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll introduce Brian Donnelly. Brian is a mechanical engineer with a diverse career path, having spent 13 years in oil and gas in roles such as reservoir engineer and business planner. Brian currently is a senior development engineer with Heartland Generation. Brian works on the CCUS component of the BRCH project, which aims to convert a natural gas power station to hydrogen fuel for clean electricity generation. And we'll be talking a little bit more about Brian's project with Heartland Generation as we continue our discussion today. Anne Halliday holds a Bachelor of Science in Geological Engineering from Queen's University and a Master of Science from the University of Calgary. With decades of experience, including 8 years on the Quest CCS project, she specializes in risk-based project development and site-specific MMV programs to ensure CO2 containment and conformance. Welcome, Anne. Thanks for joining us. And Marcia Koulis. Sorry, Marcia. I don't know that I'm going to pronounce it right.
It's all right.
Marcia brings over 15 years of technical experience, including a decade in CCS, specializing in geophysics, reservoir monitoring, and regulatory approvals. She is a recognized expert in subsurface monitoring and risk management for CO2 sequestration projects, with expertise in UIC Class 6 permits. So we'll learn a little bit more about that today as well. So thanks to the three of you for joining us. We're really pleased for you to be here, and we look forward to our discussion. So before we jump into that, I'll ask Kaylin just to share our survey. We'll ask our participants today, those of you on the call, to please take a moment to answer our survey. It helps us collect the information we need to develop engaging events for you. So we'd like to know how familiar you are with the CCUS industry. So if you can make a selection for question 1 on your screen there, that would be great. Anywhere from not familiar to extremely familiar. And question number 2, how interested are you in learning about the sector? Anywhere from not at all to very interested. And number three, which of the following best describes your current involvement? Do you work in the energy sector currently? Are you a student or researcher? Do you live in Canada and would like to learn more about CCUS? Or perhaps you're from outside of the country and are here to learn more? Once you've answered those three questions, please click the submit button at the bottom of the text box and that will send your answers to us. Great. So pleased to see we still have some people joining us. Welcome, everybody. You're just in time for us to start our session. So uh, let's get down to it. What I'll do is I'll start with our first question here. It's a real tough one for our panelists, and we'll just get everyone to take a moment and please introduce yourselves. Tell us who you are and what you do. So I'll start with Anne.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Anne Halliday, and I am a director at Carbon Alpha. At Carbon Alpha, I primarily focus on developing and managing CCS and CDR projects and assets here in Canada.
Great, thanks, Anne. And Brian.
Hi, everybody. Brian Donnelly. I am a senior development engineer here with Heartland Generation. Actually, recently we've just been acquired by TransAlta, so I am now a TransAlta employee. I work with the Battle River Carbon Hub, and I oversee the CCUS component of that large integrated project.
Great, thanks, Brian. And Marcia.
Hi, I'm Marcia Quillen. I'm the manager of subsurface risk, MMV planning, and CCS permitting for Vault 4401. I actually work on projects both in Canada and the US.
Great. Thank you. I think I want to clarify something for everyone on the call today, just to make sure that that everyone knows what we're talking about when we talk about MMV and some of the things we do in our storage projects. If could one of you maybe touch on what MMV is and what it means to CCUS?
Do you want to take it, Anne, or do I? So MMV is measurement monitoring and verification. So it is a large component of any CCS project, be it Canada or the US, that you need to start fleshing out before you ever start injecting. And part of the purpose of the MMV plan is to meet regulatory requirements in the jurisdiction you're working in, provide data to show conformance between all of the modeling you do and your actual data sets, and then demonstrate containment. So the CO2 is not moving above your confining zone or out of your storage complex. You're sort of demonstrating that you aren't endangering human health, the environment, or freshwater resources. I don't know, Anne, would you add anything to that?
Perfect. We got we got the A-OK. That's great. Thanks, Marcia. I just thought, it's always important to cover off our technical terms and when we talk about them, when we're so familiar with them, we sometimes forget maybe to explain. So thank you so much for that. Marcia, I'll actually ask you to tell us a little bit about your background. I imagine you had quite a career path to get to where you are. Could you tell us a little bit about your background, your education experience, and how you got to where you are now?
Yeah, actually, Anne and I have very similar kind of parallel backgrounds in that I did geological engineering as well, but I did it at Waterloo. She did it at Queen's. And when I finished my degree, I actually started working down in Houston for Schlumberger as a geophysicist. And I did various types of processing for surface seismic and borehole seismic for a number of years. Until that kind of got stale. And then I decided I was going to do a master's degree, which I did at the University of Calgary, again with the same thesis supervisor that Anne had. We were both with Don Lawton. and that was my introduction to CCS. So I started working on one of Don's very early projects that was looking at CO2 injection and monitoring with downhole VSPs. And from there, I went into or joined Schlumberger, which I said I was never going to do again, but I went back to Schlumberger to the Carbon Services Group, and I was there for a number of years, I think 7 years, working on various projects in Canada and the US. Yeah. And then after I left Schlumberger, I actually worked on Quest for a little while when Anne wasn't there. Um, and then I've subsequently joined Vault 4401, where again I'm working on a number of projects with a broader scope than I had been
Yeah.
previously. Yep.
Thanks. And just to clarify, Marcia, your early experience there was in oil and gas, uh,
Uh, but
or was it
my
or was
very
it in CCUS?
pre-master's degree, it was oil and gas.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Okay.
very traditional oil and gas type stuff. And then after my master's, I went into the Schlumberger Carbon Services Group. And then from then on, I've only worked on CCS projects.
Oh,
Yeah.
great. Great. Thanks. Thanks for that. Brian, let's hear a little bit about you, your background, and how
Sure.
you got to where you are.
Yeah. So I've taken a bit of a non-traditional route, bit more meandering. I did an undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering at the University of Calgary, and I feel like mechanical engineering was sort of like a faculty of general studies, but in engineering, it opened up a lot of doors, but nothing specific. Once I finished my undergrad, I took a couple of years off to just pursue some personal interests, and then when that was done, I came back and I went to graduate school. I got my PhD in mechanical engineering again, but this was actually totally not oil and gas or anything like that. It was biomedical or orthopedic engineering, predicting migration or failure of prosthetic joints inside the body. So a lot of math applied to that. Um, Once I'd finished grad school, I worked at a bike shop for a year when I was trying to figure out what I was going to do. It was a lot of fun. But I ended up staying in Calgary and I took on a role as a reservoir engineer in oil and gas. I really like the intersection of both business and the technical space and working within a multidisciplinary team. So I worked in oil and gas for 13 years in various roles. So started off in reservoir engineering, so looking at the subsurface, moved into field development planning. How would you develop a field in the most economic manner with the least disturbances? And then I moved into sort of a business planning role, which would look a little bit more at the dollars and cents and sort of policy development and corporate strategy and integrating all of that into a portfolio. The company that I worked for at the end, though, so as a development engineer, you're looking for development, but there weren't too many development opportunities happening. So I left, and as I was looking at what I wanted to do next, I'm naturally a risk averse guy, but I said I want to do something that maybe scares me a little bit because all the most enjoyable experiences were the ones for some reason were when I was under stress or challenged. Maybe that's the better way of saying it. But so I took this role with Heartland Generation, and my boss, she said, "Listen, there's risk to this project. There's a lot of white space. Are you interested in this?" I said, "Absolutely." So moved into this, and it's been fantastic. So I've been working in this role for the last 3 years.
Amazing. Yeah, that's quite the journey. It sounds like you kind of
Yeah.
had that little passion project in the in the middle there. So very cool. It sounds like that's something perhaps that you do in your spare time. Perhaps some outdoor cycling and I hear that you're a skier as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, kind of interesting to see that your career took a little turn into something you enjoy outside of work as well. Yeah. Thanks, Brian. And let's hear a little bit about your story.
Hi, yeah, thanks. And thanks, Marcia, for uh, taking away all my thunder about
Oh
geological
no.
engineering. Just joking. Just joking. Yeah, so as Marcia mentioned, like I also have a geological engineering degree from Queen's. I'm originally from Toronto, Ontario. And with those folks who maybe come from outside of the province or outside of Western Canada, my career path into oil and gas kind of was not something that was on my radar, just simply because out east, we tend to focus in a little bit more on environmental and mining applications. So my geological engineering degree was very much focused in on those aspects, on the environmental aspects
Okay.
of the subsurface and on mining. When I graduated university, I fully expected to be working in the mining industry. And in fact, my first job out of uni was working in engineering seismology for a little company called ESG back then, who was working on mining applications in Ontario. That company was very small back then in 1996, 97, which was great because I got that exposure to what it was like working at a small company, where the design and manufacturing of the electronics and the equipment and the systems were done literally across from my cubicle. So I feel like that was incredibly valuable experience, and it's interesting to see me go first full circle now working for a small shop again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, something you all touched on is that your careers took perhaps I don't know if it was unexpected, but sort of transitional turns throughout your um throughout the breadth of your experience. So maybe you could touch a little bit on what um what that looked like for you, how it might have been like how did it influence you, or how did you know what to do next, or how did you take the steps from that's a lot of questions, but getting from one place to the next? Was it something that piqued your interest? Were you just looking for change, or was it something else altogether? And maybe we'll just continue because you came from a place that
Yeah.
wasn't, traditionally oil and gas, as you say.
Yeah, well, like surprisingly, after that stint working for mining applications in Ontario, um, I then spent a very conventional, I guess, a very conventional career path through the oil and gas industry. I spent 20 years at a variety of large integrated oil and gas companies. I've worked here in Canada. I've worked internationally. I've done some stints up in Alaska. We worked in overseas in Brunei. So I've had I guess, quite a lot of opportunities working in those large integrated oil and gas companies, to work in a bunch of different roles and in a bunch of geologic environments, onshore, offshore,
Mhm.
Canada, internationally. I've worked on projects on R&D and upstream and downstream. I'm at this point, kind of taken the contrast between Marcia and I is actually really interesting because Marcia is, a technical expert in her field, whereas I've spent my 20, 25 years of my career building out my skills to be quite a generalist, I would say.
Yeah.
I've slowly become more of a generalist over time. It's been a forced, right? I started out as a technical expert
Hmm.
and now I'm much more general. Yeah.
I'd also
Yeah,
say
like,
that in this field, you almost want to be like you need to have
Yeah,
that
you
technical
do.
depth initially, but because this is still a nascent field, you need to be able to move up to that higher view and wear a couple of different hats or do have different perspectives. You need to have like energy literacy. You need to have an
Yeah.
understanding of policy development, risk management. You need that breadth of skill.
I think that's absolutely true because um, you could get modelers, geologic modelers, you could get reservoir engineers, you can get people that do all these little pieces, but to get the people that can have an overarching view of the full chain and what needs to be done from the beginning of a project to actual operations to closing a project out, and who understand how modeling and risk and modeling and monitoring all go together is actually quite challenging, I find.
For sure.
Yeah.
I also think with there's like we're all sort of technical individuals, but and I gravitate towards the technical side of things. I love my Excel spreadsheets and formulae and whatnot. Yeah, right. But this is an industry that's really affected by policy, and policy is very
Very
much
much.
changing rapidly as
Mhm.
people start to learn and understand more. So understanding how that policy is being developed, the direction it's heading, and then being able to provide input to the regulator or governing
Yeah.
entity is pretty important.
And the challenges that we're all facing because of, where policy is right now versus where it needs to go, right?
Mhm. It's still kind of a new, like CCUS has been around for decades,
Hmm.
in various forms, especially when you have projects like Shell Quest that really led the way. Um, but but probably in terms of policy, like there was a lot of catching up to do, I think. And um, so it sounds like that's really influenced kind of where you've gone and what you've had to learn, like you say, beyond your technical skills. So identifying those transferable skills must have been really important for all of you.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
guess I'll jump in here as well.
yeah.
I think we're really lucky, I think, to have a wide variety of folks here who've come from a different backgrounds.
Hmm.
Marcia is a great example of someone who was able to get some of those, like I could say, Marcia, you've kind of been in the CCS industry for a long time, right? And have kind of grown up in that. And there are lots of folks who are landing, coming out of university who are lucky enough
Mhm,
to sort of have those experiences. Like I can imagine that the U of C, courses now are using energy transition stories instead of
Hmm.
just, basic oil and gas studies to teach some of those technical fundamentals. So I feel like, folks who are graduating today versus when I'm going to put you in my box, Brian, too. Like Brian and I, you graduated like 25, almost 30 years ago, are at a much higher advantage than the rest of us who have had to kind of build up a bunch of skills and then see how
Yeah.
they apply in the industry.
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I do come from that similar place, even though my role is not technical. I'm in a English major, by area of expertise, with communications as well, and that's really where my career went. And when you think of communications, you could work in just about any industry, but being in Calgary, the the oil and gas industry is where I landed, and it's been quite an evolution from what we saw as the traditional way we provide energy to the world here in Canada into these emerging sectors,
Hmm.
such as CCUS, which really are rising and evolving over time. So I think it's interesting that you each talked about how that's changing, and that students today might not take that traditional route, or perhaps people who are new to the industry, maybe they haven't worked in energy before, and they're coming in with this opportunity to
Mm.
join, at a time that's quite exciting. Do you see this as a time where there's a chance to kind of pave the way a little bit in the sector, to further advance where the sector is headed?
My opinion is yes. I think what's exciting about this sector is that there's so much white space. There's so much that's still undefined. People are
Hmm.
finding creative solutions, and it's evolving rapidly. Unconventional thinking is something that can absolutely be applied. It's not just in the technical space, it's in the non-technical space as well. You know, I used to interact with somebody who um, was working in government relations, and she had a degree in philosophy, but she was an amazing person for engaging with government on policy development and identifying how to meet the needs of both the public's best interest as well as project proponents and striking that balance. So I think there's still a lot of space to be defined, and
Mhm.
that your generation are absolutely going to be able to step into it.
We make a lot of jokes in house about, well, we're building the plane as we fly it, right? Like
Yeah.
you've got this regulatory framework that you're trying to work in. You have this policy environment that has challenges, whichever side of the border you're on. But there's so much, because there's so few of these projects out there in the world to serve as an example. You know, once a lot of these projects get online and we start injecting, it's going to be a huge adventure, right? It's going to be super exciting because, you know, you learn new things every project you're on, and to see this ramp up and become commercial, and how everyone deals with the challenges is going to be exciting, I think.
Am I allowed to just disagree for the sake of
Oh yeah,
disagreeing?
go for
Okay,
it.
I don't know. I always feel like I build up a controversy and then I just end up agreeing with what everyone's saying. Uh, I really like your analogy about like building a plane, and I'm trying to think about one that I can use from Quest. You know, like having spent 8 years on the Quest CCS project and operation, like I kind of feel like they built like, oh, what is the Sultan of Brunei fly? Like the largest, like most gold-plated
Yeah,
airplane, like jumbo
absolutely.
airplane, right? And that, you know, what we're doing now in industry is trying to like you know, how do you make something that is like
Economic.
economic out of that, right? Like not all of us have access to gold plating for our, you know, Cessna whatever's these days.
Yeah, yeah.
But I would say like, you know, having worked here in Alberta and having worked with the Alberta government and developing at least some on the regulatory and like more local implementation of some of these policies here in Alberta, is that, you know, over the past, what would it be, like 20, 25 years, I would say Alberta's done a great job in partnership
Yeah.
with industry, you know, investing in pilot projects, you know, those old EOR projects that were done back in the, you know, 2005 and that sort of things, to these large scale commercial projects like Quest and the Alberta Trunk Line. And you know, the folks in the government have done a great job of taking that of building that legislation, of building up our regulatory framework to be, you know, to the point where as today we are recognized internationally as one of these best places, or if not the best place on earth for CCS and CCUS operations and projects. So I'm not really disagreeing with you, but I kind of like that. You know, I just wanted to give Alberta the props because we do
Yeah.
have a very strong framework to execute some of these projects. I think, you know, just to echo what Marcia has been saying, is that, you know, it's a very complicated business framework, and so a lot of the uncertainty that we're seeing today in industry comes from some more of the like the policy framework, or some of the uncertainty in federal and provincial policy that influence more of the economics and the commerciality of some of these projects. And I think that's where we are seeing a lot of the industry struggle right now. Not on the technical side, right? Like I look at
Yeah. Oh
my
no,
my peers here,
not
right?
technical.
And these aren't technical problems that we're really addressing. They're very much on that non-technical economic commercial side.
I think a lot of the technical things you encounter or challenges, um, at least things that are on my mind these days from a monitoring perspective, is, you know, you oil and gas, you're drilling a lot of wells, and because you want to maximize your production, right? In CCS, to some extent, you want to do exactly the opposite. You want to minimize drilling, you know, the same number of wells, because every hole you put in your cap rock is just another risk and leakage pathway to the surface. Um, and now I've kind of forgotten where I was going with this, but um, so the technical challenge that I'm thinking about these days is sparse seismic monitoring, right? And I'm sure you're thinking about the same thing, Anne. Like there's all these, you know, there's the traditional oil and
I
gas
think I think I think you
way.
flatter me, Marcia, about what I think
Oh,
about.
you're thinking
Yeah.
about that. That's weighing on your mind. So, I mean, there's a traditional oil and gas way that you go out and you acquire time-lapse seismic surveys, and that's your monitoring, and you have lots of wells that you can use to calibrate and pressure points, everything else. But we aren't going to have that in CCS. We are not making money putting CO2 in the ground, right? We don't have this same revenue stream that oil and gas has. So how do you make your monitoring plan more economic? And one of the big ticket items is always the seismic monitoring. So how do you approach sparse seismic monitoring? And space out your big surveys to try to learn as much as you can, but still feel like you're being a good steward or a good operator and ensuring that you're maintaining containment. So there are technical challenges in that sort of respect. But in general, I agree with Anne that, a lot of the challenges we face are sort of operating within that policy space, and how do you make a viable business doing this?
Yeah.
One of the things I was going to add on, it's how do you do it economically? But the other thing that we're seeing is that, Quest is like 1,000,000 tons per year, essentially. The projects that people are proposing are like an order of magnitude larger. The scale that we're
Yeah,
talking about
it's
is
huge.
so much bigger. And, I agree with Anne, like Alberta is one of the top places in the world. We've got the subsurface that's compatible with it. We've got the people, we've got the tool sets, we've got the technology, like all of those things. But making that jump to a larger scale and figuring out the economics of it are going to be definitely a challenge. The place where I do disagree with Anne though on this, like she's saying now, yeah, is that a lot of these problems have been sort of figured out. Like that, it's not a technical challenge, but where I disagree with that is I think the days of simple projects are gone. You're not going to
Mm,
see just a simple CCS project. It's going to be a component of a much larger, more complicated piece of kit. And the little boy inside of me gets really excited with seeing the big truck drive down the road or the big structure. These are complicated, and
Yeah.
mhm.
additionally, the policy that supports them is going to be complicated, and that's a place that we haven't figured it out. Like how do you match hydrogen with
Yep.
CCS
Right.
and electricity and all of that? So that's definitely a future challenge.
I think it's important to recognize that, at this point that, Canada is in the business of providing energy, especially here in Alberta, and we're going to do that still for a long time to come. And we should still do it for a long time to come because we are a responsible producer. Um, we have regulations. We've said that word quite a bit already today. Regulations in place. We have a policy framework. We have companies working towards solutions, and we have commitments to reaching emissions reduction goals. So I think it's important to recognize that it's not just this is a tool in the toolbox, but there are many solutions and technologies that will help us reach those emissions goals. And so, to your point, Brian, it's about those working together. Um, we have a question from someone who's watching today, and they're thinking about their career and looking towards getting involved in CCUS research. So this is taking it off of what we were talking about just a little bit, but they're asking if you could share some insights on common career pathways or what kind of roles might someone who's interested in joining into um, research in this transitioning field. What might they be looking for in their job search, and maybe perhaps even what skills should they be highlighting as something that would help them in that area in their career search?
Well, I'll jump in again. I would say that the first thing that I think anybody who's in this webinar and anybody who's spent any bunch of time working in CCS and CCUS is that we have this commonality that everybody in this industry is very purpose driven.
Mhm.
We all like this industry attracts a subset of people who
Mhm.
find personal fulfillment in the work, We enjoy like solving very, very integrated, very technically challenging problems. And so I think that's the first thing, is that you know, if you're in the industry for, I hate to say it, if you're in the industry to you know, to make money or to get ahead in your career, you know, it's very unlikely that you know, in this emerging sector is going to do that for you in a very like, you know, unlike the oil and gas industry, which has very established career paths. Now, I would say on the flip side of that, like to kind of echo what Brian was saying, there's so much innovation happening in this space right now, and there is so much like for folks who are involved in R&D, who have ideas, who are ready to start down that pathway of commercialization, like working up the TRL scale. There's a lot of opportunity out there for projects and R&D at that lower end of that TRL scale to start advancing some of these technologies to be able to de-risk, you know, complicated hydrogen projects or different types of solvents or amines or what have you.
I mean, from the technical side, I would say, or to people who have joined Vault in the last couple of years, you know, I sort of say, well, this is what we're hiring you for right now, but we are a small company. You know, I think we've got maybe 45 people in Canada and the US. And really, as we're building our plane and starting to fly it, and we're you know, ramping up to operations, there are a lot of places for your job to evolve to within a small company. So if you're joining a you know, one of the big oil companies, you probably do have this very defined role and career path. But if you're joining a smaller company, there's a lot of opportunity for you in how you drive your career and what your interests are and what you can create for yourself, I think.
When I think of this sort of advice for the next generation, I'll start off the same advice I give my son, my 9.5-year-old child. Say yes to adventure. Like that's
Yeah.
a theme. It's nobody interesting ever came out of constantly saying no. So so take on diverse opportunities, like even if they're intimidating. Um, just because you don't know the answer doesn't mean you can't figure it out. I think having that open mind and willing to try out different things is going to be really important. Other things a little more tangible, other than just sort of having an open mindset. I think energy literacy is incredibly important. I think that oil and gas, despite what you might read in some media outlets, oil and gas is here for quite a long time.
Mm-hmm.
The energy mix is only becoming more complex. So having an understanding of how these different tool sets interact and play with each other is pretty important. And then I've already sort of touched on like the technical side of things. Like oil and gas actually does give you a lot of the skill sets that you will need because you're still drilling wells for CCS. You're still using an oil rig to drill that, or a drilling rig, sorry, to drill that well. The technology is very similar, but we've talked about government policy, and I think risk management, which actually plays to Marcia and Anne. Risk management and understanding that is going to be very big because these CCS projects are multi-decade, and you need to understand your risk management before you even inject anything into the ground, before you've even, you know, put a shovel in the ground, through operations, through to closure, like post-injection, and understanding what is happening at the end. Because with CCS projects, your highest risk is on the last day of operation because you have your highest pressure and whatnot. So risk management is another area that I would say is good to investigate.
And it, you know, it sounds like we're talking about transferable skills, and you said it earlier, Brian, too. I think that having, like you said, energy literacy, and knowing the business. So really, it sounds like we're saying do your research for those who have this question. Do your research, understand the space, both in terms of the broader energy picture, but also, you know, take your technical knowledge, but then expand it beyond that so that you have a better understanding of what's happening in the environment, and how business, like the business strategy, will support these projects.
Yeah, but at the same time, like you're looking at a group of folks here who are like we are leaders in the industry, right? Like as much as Marcia likes to try to flatter me, I am not a very technical person. I haven't had a technical role since like 2010. Um, but when you think about the scale of some of these projects, and the last time I was up in Fort McMurray, a year ago, talking to the folks who are working in the oil sands, like they're talking about, like, these are mega projects that we're talking about,
Yeah.
right? Like Birch, it's a mega project. You don't just need like, I have 25 years in the industry. Like I'm a leader. I know how to integrate these projects. I've flown a plane, well, not a real plane, but like a gold-plated plane. I know how these projects are supposed to go through their cycle. I know how they're supposed to operate. To a certain degree, again, with the non-technical, but underneath that, there's a massive amount of skill that Alberta needs in our industry to be able to support these, right? Like I think about my friends in the downstream side of things who are doing operations, maintenance, pressure integrity, instrumentation, controls, fabrication, right? Like, with a lot of the incentives that we have, we need to be able to support these projects in Alberta and in Canada, to be able to make these massive capture units, to manufacture the equipment that we need to be able to do this. So even though what the folks that you have gathered here in the room here have experience with these large billion-dollar integrated projects, like in order to get those large billion-dollar projects on the go, you need those skills just applied to different facets of the industry. So just because you're a mechanical engineer, fresh out of university, you may not be, jumping to a role just like what Brian's doing today. It'll take you 25 years to get there, but you now have the opportunity that we didn't, of working in these projects and seeing how your pressure vessels are integrated into a larger amine unit, which then fall into, blah, 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 building up a big capture unit. So I think there will be, once FID happens on more of these larger scale projects, I think we're really going to see the opportunities evolve for folks here in Alberta.
Yeah.
I hope so, at least.
Likewise.
Yeah.
Is there a feeling that, in your organizations, and perhaps, your knowledge of the broader sector, is there a feeling that we are in a place where we're going to have a labor shortage, where, as you say, projects might be getting close to final investment decisions, and are there workers going to be needed to support these projects?
I mean, I think there will be, but if there's one thing I've learned about, I think one of your question is, what has surprised you about working in the sector? Like the need for patience. CCS has always been about patience because everything just takes so much longer than it does in oil and gas, right? We've got a project down in the States where, well, multiple projects where we've been putting in permits to be able to drill wells to actually inject CCS or CO2. And our first one we submitted 2.5 years ago.
Okay.
It's gonna take us a minimum of 3 years to get permission just to drill a well.
Yeah.
Not even to inject CO2
Yeah,
into it.
I think the turnaround's a little quicker in Alberta.
It
Yeah.
absolutely is. But in Alberta, we're more in a situation where we're waiting for the facilities to be built and the capture to be able to happen, right? So I think that it's coming, but I don't think it's probably coming as fast as anybody would like to see it arrive. If that makes sense.
There's still a lot of iteration.
There's still a lot of
Definitely
iteration
for sure.
for us to actually start injecting
Get there.
on either side of the border.
Alberta does have the advantage though, like CCS has
Mhm.
the same regulator as oil and gas. There's
Yep.
we're modifying the regulatory pathway from oil and gas. So
Yes.
we have all of this experience, but there are a lot of jurisdictions that don't have that experience, and they're looking to Alberta to get that better understanding.
Mhm.
But there absolutely is going to be a lot of time. It's going to take more time than we anticipate.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's true. There are things we can leverage when we talk about CCUS, the regulatory space being one of them, being similar to oil and gas. I imagine infrastructure, and we have some existing infrastructure that can be used. We're talking about wells, we're talking about where are we going to store CO2, after we capture it. So we do have a question here about CO2 storage in Alberta. We have significant capacity, and that's because we have, you will know better than I do, but geological conditions that support that. So maybe we can talk about just really briefly, perhaps high level, the mechanics of why Alberta is a good place to store CO2.
Do you want to take it, Anne?
Like
Yeah, you've worked on the
I know,
injecting
like,
project.
yeah, like I can speak for like days on like to the very high level details of why Alberta is such a great place. Like fundamentally, Alberta is a very the Western Canada is a very mature basin. We have a lot of opportunities for the types of the scale of projects of injection that we need from small scale to large scale. In terms of the subsurface itself, there are kind of two options, saline aquifers and depleted oil and gas fields. Both are just, I would say that not one is better than the other. There are lots of projects that are targeting depleted oil and gas reservoirs for long-term geologic storage. But the saline aquifers that we have available to us here in Western Canada are like, par to none. I think, some of the original studies done, 20, 25, 30 years ago by Stefan Bachu, the Alberta predecessor to Alberta Innovates, identified gigatons and gigatons of storage here in Western Canada. So although there is a process to de-risk that storage for your specific project, from a very high level, it just adds to that, I guess, positive environment that we have here in Alberta for projects.
Yeah, there's opportunity and
Mhm,
there's, space. And how does
mhm.
that compare to other jurisdictions? The US, Marcia was talking about that, Europe, the Middle East. Where how do we compare?
I personally, I think Alberta is in a really good spot from a regulatory perspective, right? Absolutely, other jurisdictions in the world look at Alberta and, the regulatory framework that's in place and learn from it. I think when you go offshore and your North Sea or your, Gulf Coast of Mexico, that becomes a different ball game, not only from a, regulatory perspective, but how you construct a project, how you monitor a project. It's a completely different beast that people are dealing with. So
Mm.
the CCS business there is just way different than I think anything that's onshore. Um, the US is quite variable to work in, right? So you have some states that have primacy. Those states tend to have a high level of oil and gas literacy, and so they can progress things faster. But again, the opportunities are quite variable depending on what basin you're in, right? So North Dakota has a lot of oil and gas experience. Um, a lot of their targets are quite deep. In the Midwest, where I do a lot of work, the CCS targets are actually awesome. I would argue in some ways they're better than Alberta's are, because there is a very thick basal sandstone there that people are
Mhm.
looking at, but the regulatory environment is way less amenable to actually being able to get things done. And, you know, you see way less of the hub style developments progressing there and way more one of projects that have, you know, minimal pipelines in order to get things off the ground. And then the Gulf Coast again is just a complete Louisiana, Texas is just another completely different ball game.
We can move CO2, we capture CO2 and then we can move it and for storage. And to some, and in some cases, you know, conversion or utilization. Arguably the best way to do that, perhaps the safest, most efficient, is through pipelines. What do you we have a question about CO2 grade pipelines and their role in transporting CO2. We have the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line. What kind of capacity do we have, and what might be the plan for these large projects to transport CO2 for storage?
I feel like that must be a Brian question.
Yeah.
Well, it depends on the project. Everything's going to be project specific. It could be site specific where you build out your own infrastructure, depending on whether your emissions are captured off of a single facility and you have suitable subsurface targets proximal to that location. You also have, certainly with the carbon hub model, the idea like you have like a hub and spoke. So you'll have multiple locations. So you'll have multiple pipelines, multiple wells potentially. So there are different configurations that you can have, but you need to understand what your subsurface looks like and what your emission sort of sources are in the proximity that you have. But in terms of managing transportation of CO2, I'm sure most of the people on the line are probably already familiar of compressing the CO2 down into dense phase and keeping it in that dense phase so it has the density of a liquid, but it has the friction of a gas. So you can move a lot of the volumes with minimal horsepower. But when you're in the dense phase, also your metallurgy is going to be affected by the composition of your CO2 and any impurities in there. So there's definitely some work in that space, and corrosion management is a huge one. But it's going to be project specific. I'm not trying to dodge, but you've got pipelines that have been transporting for decades. The technology's out there, but I know further work will be done to come up with new ones.
I think one of the biggest problems with the pipeline piece is the public perception, right? Like that is probably, if it's not the biggest challenge to pipelines, it's got to be, you know, top 5 biggest challenges to pipelines. And that's maybe not so much the case in Alberta, but other places, the pipeline issue is, from a public perception perspective, is massive and is killing projects.
When you saw that in the States with is it the Greenbelt pipeline, and again it comes back to scale. We're talking about millions of tons of CO2 per year being sequestered. You can't use trucks to transport that. Like you need large diameter pipelines at high pressure. Engagement with stakeholders like local people, First Nations. I think Canada has that experience. Alberta has that experience. They understand the importance of it. That has to continue.
Those are some good thoughts. Well, we are getting close to the top of the hour. So, we do have a poll that we want our participants to do, which will start in a moment. But perhaps I can ask you to wrap up with, we've talked a little bit about the economics, the complexity of CCUS projects. Maybe we can talk a little bit about what are your thoughts on why CCUS is a part of Alberta's energy future. why are we doing all this? Why are we trying to solve these challenges and be innovative in the space and develop this technology and implement it? Why is CCUS a part of Alberta's energy future?
Me personally, I think it's something going forward it's going to be a part of it. Any development on an industrial scale. We see climate change. I look at my child. I want him to be able to grow up and do the things that I love to do, like go hiking and biking and skiing in the mountains. Uh, I think that while there's uncertainty at the moment, eventually this is just going to be part of base business. It may take time, just as Marcy said, you got to be patient, but I think people have an awareness of social responsibility, and I feel this plays a large role.
Yeah, Marcia.
Yeah, I agree with Brian. I mean, ages ago, people used to talk about the Princeton wedges. I don't know if Brian and Anne have seen the Princeton wedges, but it basically says, like, if we want to meet our climate goals, then there has to be a huge number of things in, arrows in our quiver to be able to meet those goals. And some of it's got to be renewables, and some of it's got to be hydro, and some of it's got to be nuclear. And CCS is one of those, arrows in the quiver that is going to help to bring down emissions over time. And there isn't one magic technology that is going to get us there. It just has to be one of the things in the portfolio that we implement in order to bring down those CO2 emissions. So I don't see how we get to where we want to go and make an impact on climate change if we aren't doing CCS.
And Anne.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add to Brian and Marcia, right? I think it's this is something that we have to do. It's not something that from a personal standpoint, I want to make as big an impact as possible before I leave this industry onto wherever I go next in retirement. But yeah, I think this is just something that we have to do as industry. I think the uncertainty around the uncertainty and the challenges for our industry at this time are really impacting some of the investment in this sector, which is really going to impact how quickly we can get some of these on. And that'll just, what's likely in Alberta is that with some of these, mega projects like pathways, when they come online, they might become a bit of a backlog for some of these smaller projects. So despite these challenges, I'm really hoping that within the next year and the next election cycles, that we'll just continue to see that commitment to working our carbon price, which is really our incentive for this waste management industry. Continued commitment to that carbon price so that these projects that are ready to go and hit FID can start running, and then all of us will have a job for life.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you for your thoughts. We certainly appreciate you being here today. I'll just remind everyone that they can review the full webinar series at the Alberta Carbon Hub, albertacarbonhub.com. We have recorded each of our 5 webinars in the series, including today's, which will be available after this session. So please check it out. We also have some great resources relating to CCUS, and certainly if you're looking to improve your knowledge of CCUS, that's a great place to start. So Kaylin, I'll ask you just to launch our post-webinar survey. I want to thank our speakers today while our participants are answering the questions. Thank you, Anne and Brian and Marcia, for joining us today. Your insights have provided some great information, and I hope our listeners gained a lot of value out of our conversation today. I certainly enjoyed it and learned a lot myself. So please do let us know, everyone, how you found the overall quality of the webinar content. Did we do a good job? Did we answer your questions and give you a good discussion today? We'd also like to know how valuable you found the information presented in the webinar. And we'd like to know if you would consider a career transition after this discussion today. Have we inspired you to learn more about CCUS and consider working in the sector? Perhaps joining those of us who are already here and making a difference, as Marcia, Brian, and Anne said, that really is a large part of the spirit of what we're doing in CCUS. And would you like to learn more? And once you've answered those questions, please hit submit at the bottom of your screen so that we can capture those questions and answers. So thanks everyone for joining us today, and thanks again to our speaker panel, Marcia, Brian, and Anne. Really appreciate your time today and participating in this engaging conversation.
Thank
I hope
you.
everyone
Okay, thank you.
I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thanks for tuning in to the CCUS webinar series. We hope to bring you more great content on this topic soon. So thanks everyone, and have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.